Welcome to the Pillars of Leadership podcast. Today we have Dr. Stephen Cutchins with us. Hey there, Stephen.
It's good to see you.
You too. I was looking at your latest bio, and I think we'd take up the whole podcast here if I went through it. We're going to talk a little bit about that transition because you can't seem to sit still. Is that true?
Well, I've had three different careers. Yeah. I started off as a school teacher right out of college and then made a pretty non-traditional transition into local church ministry, which I've been doing for 20 years. And now I've made another transition into higher education, which is, part of our connection was doing some studies in higher education. And, it's an interesting journey making a transition back into education, but in higher education versus where I was when I first came out of college myself years ago.
Yeah, we'll connect the dots a little bit because I'm interested in how you dealt with that transition. I think that will help people.
Mhm.
That's often a big thing to go through. And did you do anything to prepare? We'll talk about that. But a little bit on the background here, a doctorate of ministry, master's in religion, Southern Evangelical Seminary.
You got it.
PhD, this is you're working on the PhD in the leadership studies at Dallas Baptist.
Hmm.
Got the shirt here. I
I
got
like the
the shirt.
swag.
I got the shirt, man. Okay.
I
Come
have that same shirt, by the way. I
I
just felt it
know.
would be inappropriate for us to wear the same shirt.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good. And then so you spent time in um, several colleges and seminaries. You teach,
Yeah.
executive board member, pastoral leadership, and you did the youth pastor thing, the worship pastor thing. You play the trumpet. You were a music director. You've written a couple books. We'll talk about your latest one, Prove It, here at near the end of the session. 3 marathons. Is that true?
Maybe four.
Seriously. Okay. What was your best
Ye-
time?
Years ago. My best time was 4:24. And if I'm doing my math correctly, that's about a 10-minute mile on average. And I can run a 10-minute mile almost indefinitely, but much faster than that, I'm not your guy.
I
I'm a
can do
long
a 10,
distance
I
guy.
could do a 10-minute
Oh
mile.
yeah. Oh yeah. But
One time.
can you do it for
No,
26.2 miles? That's
no,
the real question.
no, I can't.
Yeah.
So you're married with a couple daughters, and Dr. Ken Hemphill said you're a people person, which I would validate. During our 7 years of PhD study, you were a magnet. You're a family man. I think you just finished up a marriage conference this weekend to help
That's correct.
others. You're a
Up in the
leader,
mountains of North Carolina, yeah.
North Carolina, right? Yep.
Yeah, we were up in the Asheville area with I don't know, probably about 30 couples or so.
That was great. Yeah, I
Yeah.
followed that a little bit. And you're a leader with a servant's heart. And most importantly, you're my hairstyle inspiration.
You're a man after my own head.
Appreciate you, man.
My wife won't let me do the goatee and stuff,
Well,
so
it
I'm a little
keeps, I don't
jealous.
know if, yeah, it's getting a little gray here. So, but that shows wisdom. So, not age. But anything I missed there that you want to highlight? We'll talk about your transition a little bit, but anything on your history or anything else, pressing on you right now from a what you're doing standpoint?
No, I would just add to the conversation just the irony that this is an important topic. Literally, right before we jumped on to record this podcast, I was talking with a young guy that's 25, who I don't know, but he was connected with a mutual friend of ours. He knows a couple that I'm also connected with up in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. And he was just talking to me and saying he was directed to me specifically because he's in a transition and feels like he's being called to something different from where he is. And that's that's a common conversation that I'm having these days with
Yeah.
folks. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts? I know you have thoughts. What are your thoughts on how do you get ready for that? There's sometimes when God might just open a door and you get a call, and I haven't heard an audible voice myself, but
Yeah.
it happens quickly. But a couple of these changes in your life right now have been because of relationships and work you've done over decades, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that let me start by saying I believe that from a spiritual standpoint, I've seen this more and more that God calls you to something and not away from something. That's an
Mhm.
important thing to say is that there is a purpose in the transition. And The messy middle sometimes is where we lose focus on that. The messy middle is what I would define as the point in which you, in a transition, you've gone far enough that you can't go back,
Right.
but you're not sure you're going to get to the other side yet.
Yeah.
You're just not sure. And maybe that's because of energy or opportunity or whatever it is. You may be pushing through, somebody may be listening to this, pushing through that messy middle in their life, whatever it is. Those are the moments where you just have to continue to step forward in faith and reconnect with your why. Like, what is the motivation behind this? Because if you lose your why, you lose your way. You can
Good.
wander off or just kind of get stuck in that messy middle, and that becomes, instead of a river in your life, it becomes like a stinky swamp. It's just nasty, and nothing good comes of that from a momentum standpoint. So moving forward is an important thing when you're in transition, because you can't steer a parked car, if you will. I hate to keep using these little illustrations, but these are the things that I think about and say a lot with folks that are in transition is you need to be taking active steps forward. And I think of a couple of different areas with this. One is in the area of networking. To your point, the network, who do you know and who knows you, is really important when it comes to opportunities. The wider your network, the wider your opportunity base. And I think of a triangle, if you will, of 3 points with the networking, and not a triangle with a tip at the top, but maybe one that's laying on a table with three sides, and maybe you're lifting up one of the three sides in the networking lane. And again, this may be an oversimplification. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but I think of know, like, and trust. Those are the three on that triangle of networking. Do people know who you are? That's just, I mean, if they don't know who you are, they don't have any opinion. They don't have any reason to help any transition or even think of you if there's an opportunity. So you have to be known to somebody. Then there's the liking piece. Do I like this person? Do I have chemistry with this person? Would I be comfortable recommending this person for another position, and having my name associated with them stepping into that environment? So knowing people, liking people, and then trusting. That's the big one. Trust is such a big one. Trust is built in drops, but lost in buckets. And it can't be microwaved. Trust is one of those things that is it's slow cooked. And when trust erodes, the pace of things really slows down. So there's a pace and a movement of trust, a pace of movement that comes along with high trust. High trust, high pace. Low trust, low pace. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. If trust is low, it's going to take you longer and cost you more to get anything done. So who do I know? Who I have chemistry with? Who likes me? Who is it that and I don't mean like on Facebook hitting a button. I'm talking about somebody like, I like you, Doug. I mean, we have a good connection. That's why we're doing this together, right? So this is a direct result of that type of thing. I know you, I like you, and I trust you. And trust is one of those things that is built with consistency over time. I think, and so these
Yep.
relationships don't start today. As a friend of mine in Austin used to say, you can't plant apple seeds in the evening and expect to drink apple juice in the morning.
Right.
There's a growth pattern that comes along with trust. So the transition piece, the opportunities of it, and the activity of even the messy middle and the landing. But a lot of people just don't land it. They mess up the landing, and it hurts them. But it goes back to that networking piece. Who's for me and who's with me? And
Good.
I think it's important also to say, in our relationship, for example, we have been together in certain environments and for certain seasons for purposes, specifically the PhD studies we did. But not everybody that's with you is for you. And I don't mean that in a ominous way. They just may not be in that circle of know, like, and trust.
Right.
They just may not, have that with you. But also, not everybody that's for you is always going to be with you. And so when you're able to build that level of networking in those three areas with a certain group of people, it also helps it helps you connect with people that would be in places that you might want to transition to or transition into positions. When you talk to young people in high school, for example, they don't know what they want to do with their lives a lot of times. And I remember, even as a youth pastor or even when I was a public school teacher, sometimes the question I would ask would be, do you know anyone that's doing something that you would enjoy doing?
Hmm.
You know?
That's a
And
that's a
yeah,
that's a big one. I'm going to jump in a second
yeah,
because
please do.
this is just recently that because if you're an introvert and if you don't like sales, if you don't like marketing, if you don't like people, okay, maybe that's an overstatement, but it may be a stretch for you to do what you're doing, but I've really been challenged in that in LinkedIn and social media is finding just what you're saying there. Find people who are like thinkers. They're focused on leadership, academics, maybe aerospace, maybe teaching. It doesn't matter, but it's shocking to me just in the last 3 months because I've been unemployed is just finding people that are like-minded and some of the connections that have been made, even if you're not comfortable with that, stretching yourself and doing it.
Yeah, putting yourself out there is I haven't spent much time in sales, but I know that rejection is high in that industry. And I think when you're in transition, you're always taking that risk, and you have to have not only high risk tolerance level, but high rejection tolerance level, because it's just going to hurt sometimes. It's just a big dose of reality until something real comes along. A lot of times we don't choose our friends, we choose our activities, and then we develop friendships and networks and connectivity in the context of those activities. And in our relationship, it just happens to be one of those. I didn't know you. There's no reason for us to have naturally connected and
Yeah,
to be friends, but the networking between the two of us is we both chose the same activity, and we wound up developing a relationship in the midst of that.
that's good. Look at that. Can you see
Look at
that?
this guy. Oh yeah, I remember that moment.
That was Europe. Where were we? Sharing the
Yeah,
set?
is that John Newton's church? Maybe no.
Yes. Yes, it was. There was a pulpit to the left. I remember you at the pulpit
Mhm.
preaching a fake sermon, I
I
think.
remember. Yes, exactly. We took some pictures and had a group photo.
That was a quick one. All right. I want to show you this because I do, especially at my age and when you get to Gen X and maybe boomer years, you can see the sigmoid curve.
Yeah,
All right, so I started in my 30s with thinking about what do I want to do in retirement? Not that I believed retirement was biblical and that I was going to, bask on the golf course or beach, but what do I want to do when I grow up? And that oftentimes people are stuck in a career or in a job that maybe their calling is to take care of their family and be the provider, but that's not their passion. And so, we've done that. Getting a PhD was maybe it wasn't a passion, but it was to achieve an end, right?
a purpose.
Uh,
Yeah,
to get educated. And so doing that and jumping on the red curve while you're still involved in your old world. Talk about that a little bit because I think you sacrificed time. You had multiple endeavors going on, being on boards and making those connections while you were still pastoring, right? And
yeah,
so that was preparation for your next career. You mentioned three segments that your career's been in. Talk about that a little bit. How did you handle that as a leader, as a father, um, as a guy?
yeah. I think the phrase that comes to mind first of all is stepping back in order to step forward. So you you can step back into a posture of learning at any point in your life. I really believe leaders are learners, and that's an important thing if you want to continue to be open for transition. So, for example, I was just talking with a guy about my story, and when I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, Doug, I was serving as a worship pastor at a church, and as things went on, the uh, the vision of me being in some other role other than worship or music became more clear. But in order to step into that later on, which was eventually 7 years as a senior pastor, I needed to do the prerequisite work, which was, even though I had a master's degree and an undergraduate degree already, I went back to seminary and got a second degree, a second master's degree, and then a doctorate of ministry. And you fast forward, I did that, in a season of life where it probably didn't change my pay. It didn't make me any more
Mhm.
credible in the position that I had. But then you fast forward about 5 years later, and I had an opportunity to step into a senior pastor position. And it's that education that I had done in the space where I was already competent and kind of settled in, stepping back into education, stepping back into a learning posture, set me up so that when the opportunity came, I had everything that I needed, not only on my resume, but in my mind and in my heart. So the way I talk about it, Doug, is it's like, the day to start a savings account is not the day you lose your job. The day to start a retirement account is not the day you announce you're going to
Right.
retire. And it's the same thing with the prerequisite things. I'm pretty convinced the church that I just pastor is a multi-million-dollar church, thousands of members. All of the pastors before me that were still living had a doctorate degree. And so even though I was on staff, I was known, liked, and trusted in the congregation at the time at which my predecessor left. I don't think I would have become a candidate or the candidate, or certainly not the senior pastor, after an interim time, had I not had that doctorate in front of my name. And if I had tried to, in that moment, during that 3-month interim time, activate some kind of doctoral program, I would have even been accepted or started in my first class, much less walk across the finish line with that. So I think um, the idea that you should dress for the job you want and not the one you have is another way of saying what we're talking about when it comes to networking, education, training, and equipping. Sometimes you have to preload some things and be ready for the season that's not there yet, and dress for the job you want, not the one you have, but doing that in a professional way, not just in a physical way.
Well,
So, what are your
yeah,
thoughts on?
it's it is a matter of planning, and some people are built that way, and some people
Yeah.
aren't. But as you start to think, gosh, it didn't occur to me that, hey, I want to get a PhD because I miss school. I really
Mm,
school. That wasn't why. And
right.
it was I wanted to teach someday. I
That's
wanted
right.
to be able to educate and inspire and influence. And so, it might just be someone starting a class, taking a class around your passion area,
Yeah. Take that
uh,
first step.
volunteering. There's a number of different things you can do, and to pray about it. But um, you mentioned learning, and I want to talk about that. William Young wrote a book called Created to Learn. And he talks about three components of growth and learning:
Yeah.
knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And really built around Colossians 1:9, Paul praying, and he says to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. And so I started to do a little bit of research on that, and kind of looking at the Bible, and then just looking at how I'm built. And I created this. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah. That's great.
So this whole concept of knowledge is what we're just talking about, really. I think with the PhD, the classroom experience, the information, the facts, the concepts, the principles, the equipping, and you can overdo information, right? And a lot of my
Oh,
professors
yeah.
years were really great about just throwing information at me. I just created an online leadership course, and it's 220 pages. So I can
Nice.
dump information on someone, but
Hmm.
that's just the knowledge part, right? The instruction, the equipping piece of it. The understanding piece is a little bit more of the saturation, the comprehension, the putting it all together, the word, um, kind of a synthesis, application. So that's where the homework, the experiential discovery and learning, taking the sermon that was preached on Sunday and soaking in it, praying on it, meditating, reflecting on it, right? That's a little harder in our society with when you don't have margin. Richard Swenson wrote a good book on margin. Sometimes you have to force yourself to find that margin, but um, then you have wisdom, which is basically the full knowing. One of the big words I learned in my PhD that I really liked was praxis, the practical application. So applying the knowledge, the whole, the personal experience, the emotions, kind of that discovery process of what is God's will. how can I begin to teach to others, influence, inspire? And you find the research shows you find a lot of meaning when you are fully exercising God's calling or when you're in God's will. So I loved, and I'd like your thoughts on this. Maslow said the desire to become everything that one is capable of becoming. Now, he was talking about self-actualization, right? Not really a calling necessarily. But what are your thoughts on this? Does that, when you look back at your journey and whether it was a learning experience, do you see any of this come to fruition with the knowledge, the understanding, the wisdom? Do you have a favorite out of these? Maybe you like the knowledge part or the being the recipient of the knowledge, the reading, and but you hate the application. Any thoughts?
First thing that comes to mind is partly what I like to give, and then the what I like to receive. So typically, my reception is on the information side, but I love to give the application. Maybe that's because I've served a lot of time as a preacher, trying to help people answer real questions, or a Christian apologist trying to say, hey, well, what is the question and how do we answer it in a way that actually makes sense? But I think all of this does push back to some of our conversations in previous situations we've been about how we understand intelligence at all. So you think about intellectual intelligence, IQ, emotional intelligence, EQ, and then cultural intelligence, which is CQ, if you will. So IQ, EQ, and CQ, all of them are based on and supported by the idea of what is it, or the question, maybe is a better way of saying it, the question of what does it mean to have or to possess this type of intellect, to understand it and to apply it in a wise way. And I think of the idea in four portions in any of those areas: IQ, EQ, or CQ. When you're going through a transition, I think your intellectual knowledge transfers with you. Even if you're learning a new skill, it's transferable. The intellect is transferable from location to location, from job to job, from time zone to time zone. The emotional intelligence also is transferable. It's what you feel and how you understand people's feelings, and different personality types is transferable. But that cultural intelligence is one of those that is captured in the space in which it's in. I think that's why the networking is a big part of transitioning and staying connected with people, even when you're not in the same place with them anymore, because that affects how you move forward in transitions. And so the Cultural Intelligence Institute, David Livermore's group, they really talk a lot about this. The four elements being expressed of intellect in general being expressed in a culturally intelligent CQ type structure. So you have the idea that drive is a part of this, or your motivation, your level of persistence. Like, are you going to quit in the middle? Are you going to sit down? What's your level of drive? That affects transition. That affects, especially when you're going from one culture to another, or when I say culture, I don't mean that ethnically, although that's a component of it. A culture is a wider umbrella than just ethnicity. That's a big part of it. But identity, core values in an organization. You can go from one tech company to another tech company, and the culture is very different. You can go from one department in a higher education institution to another department, and the culture is different. And part of that, the first part, is that drive, that motivation. What is the level of CQ drive that we have? The other one really is about what you were talking about, that knowledge. Like, how much do we really know, and how important is that? Like, the cognitive aspects of this, like, how much do we know about what we're doing, and how similar is it to the other people that we're working with? Are my competencies and my understandings at a similar level to the person I'm working with? So drive, knowledge. I think the other one that's really important is what I would call metacognition, but you might call it strategy, if you will. Thinking about what you're doing, or thinking about your thoughts. That's really what metacognition is the idea of considering your thoughts. Again, from a biblical standpoint, taking every thought captive, if you will, but just in a broader sense, it doesn't have to be as over spiritualized. It's just the idea that I know things, but I can also think about what I know. And so the level to which we're able to do that and to plan for different type things before they happen, especially in transition. Drive, knowledge, metacognition is a big piece of how you navigate that, especially in the context of group. And then the last one is probably just your behavior patterns.
Right.
Like, what is your behavior? What is your default? And a lot of times when you do this with groups, you've done this and you've worked in some large organizations, led a lot of people. Not everybody's behavioral patterns are the same. And a lot of times, if you say, all right, well, do you like high power or more distributed power? Like one person calling all the shots or everybody working together collaboratively? A lot of people will say, well, it depends. I'm kind of in the middle. Well, the answer really exposes itself when you're in transition or under pressure from a timeline, or you feel like you have something to accomplish and it's urgent. What is your default going to be in your behavior? So your drive, your intellect, your ability to think about what you're thinking about, and then the other piece of it is just straight up behavior. Like, what is your natural default behavior, and who are you going to work well with, and who are you not going to work well with in those types of transitions? I mean, that's some stuff that we talked about years ago, but I think
Yeah.
about that when I think about transition, because typically when you're transitioning, it's not just you that's changing, it's your environment and your team, and all those things are happening.
Right.
Because, and I want to say this too, I've been in some organizations for 10 plus years, and a friend of mine I had lunch with earlier this week. He's been in his position for 35 years. He's a senior pastor of a large church up in the Charlotte area, and was having lunch with him. And he's been there 35 years. And I remember talking with him one time, and I said, "Man, what's it been like to pastor your church for 35 years?" And his answer was really interesting to me. He said, "I haven't pastored my church for 36 years or 35 years." He said, "I've pastored 6 different churches in those 35
Oh,
years because transition happens even in the context of a same leadership team. Seasons change, right? There's a season for everything, and you got to be able to move fluidly even in the context of one place."
Yeah. And it's not just rebranding and putting a new logo up. I mean, that's
No.
people see through that. I was reading Peter Senge's book, The Art of Learning, and just going through
Mm,
that.
yeah.
And because most organizations are not learning organizations. They're
They're not.
results oriented organizations, and they skip the learning part, which can help people get to the results
That's so true.
more thoroughly. But he talks about, building learning communities, making time to dialogue and discuss, not just speeches, initiatives, fad. I think he was talking about one Fortune 500 company that the employees said, "Here we go again, AFP." And I said, "Well, what was AFP?" Now, he used the acronym. He said another fine program, but the employees weren't calling it another fine program. They used
No,
a,
it's a different F word, it sounds
a
like.
different word, but there's a
Yeah.
frustration, and people can see through that. And so having the time, one
Mm,
thing that I did in one of my roles was
mm,
forcing time on the agenda for reflection, for dialogue, for critical thinking. I knew what I wanted to do as leader. Now, I don't know if all the followers wanted to follow. Um, and sometimes you never figure that out, right? You figure it out a year or two down the road. Hey, two of the
mm.
seven didn't follow. But taking the time, whether it's focus groups or who was the guy who said go to the balcony? Um, I can't remember. There's a I'll have to get the author of that, but he says get out from the dance floor, go up to the Heifetz, Ronald
Yeah.
Heifetz said get up to the balcony and just take time and observe.
Yeah.
Have dialogue, have some one-on-ones away from the dance floor, talk to people you're usually not used to talking to, get their opinions and thoughts, and that will challenge your own thinking and possibly your paradigm and others. So I liked what you talked about is integrate that learning and your daily roles. Do you see as I think I was on the SES website
Yeah.
uh, when I was reading through this Peter Senge book again. And it's not a book you just read through. I'll be honest, I didn't read
Okay.
through it, skimmed through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he talked about integrated thinking, and I noticed on the SES website it talked about integrating, and I see this in you, Stephen, is different niches that you've created, but then you bring them all together. The pastoring, I think the website talked about theology, philosophy, marketplace, ministry, apologetics. Talk about that integrated, you've got so many integrated pieces of your life, or maybe disparate, that you've integrated.
Yeah, I think the point's well taken. There are a lot of things that fit probably well under the idea of just philosophy. So if I were going to pick a prince of all disciplines that is the umbrella for all of those things, it would probably be philosophy. So nothing against theology or psychology or any ology. Philosophy is the idea of just taking things and putting them in an organized, you know, clearly structured, organized way of thinking and compartmentalizing. And I mean, I don't want to oversimplify philosophy, by the way, but that's why when you go and get a PhD, people say, well, what did you get a PhD in? Because what is a PhD? It's a philosophical doctorate.
Right.
So in the academic world, a philosophical doctorate is not, it's not that a philosophical doctorate is better than any other one. It's just more demanding, because what it's doing is it's asking you to go into an area of study and look at it philosophically. And then the demand in the PhD program academically is to make an original contribution to that area. So the bigger overarching idea of a philosophical doctorate, I suppose you could get a philosophical doctorate in philosophy and the ideas of philosophy, but a philosophical doctorate is not held captive by philosophy. Philosophy is the overarching idea that fits, whether it's apologetics or music education or education itself. Like, what's your philosophy of education? What's your philosophy of worship? What's your philosophy of theology? What's your philosophy of leadership? These are the types of language that you would use, because again, it's not that it's the prince of all disciplines because it's better than, it's just the one that is used to organize each one of them. You really can't do theology without borrowing from philosophy. Norm Geisler, my mentor, used to say, you can't be aware of you can't beware, like the Bible talks about beware of certain types of philosophies, right? But you can't beware of philosophy if you're not aware of philosophy. You have to understand what it is in order to actually navigate it, And so I think, going back to you were talking about the different layers. I think a lot about the front stage, the backstage, and the offstage aspects of the leader. Front stage is what you do when you're out front, whatever that task is, whatever the thing is that you get, that you're measurable. If you're a performer, you're on stage. If you're an athlete, you're at the game. You're on stage.
The metric, the result,
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But then there's this other activity of our life that's what I would call backstage. And again, I'm borrowing from some of my music years. It might be called a green room. A backstage might be the locker room in athletics, when I played athletics, So the backstage is what you're doing when you're not doing the thing on stage, but you're getting ready or you're recovering from, right? In an organized way, even collaboratively. You're still with the team. You're just not out on the field, right? The whole team's out doing backstage. But then there's this other thing that I think we miss a lot. And it's, you ask about how do I integrate all this? I think that you have to have not only a really effective, high capacity on stage and a really organized backstage area, you also have in your life, you have to create an offstage, that place where you are disconnected from all of it. And, it's not selfish to take care of yourself. Self-care is not selfish. So you were talking about reflecting and stepping away. And, sometimes if you need a breakthrough and you're not getting it, I think the best thing you can do if you need a breakthrough is take a break, especially if you're in creativity or if you're dealing with people, because people suck energy from you, and certain people do deposit back. But if you're a leader, you're probably surrounded with more people that by the nature of your position require something from you, and they're not really fueling you back up. So my thought on this is that offstage thing is what we miss so much, especially today, because we're always available.
Yeah.
It's just constant. We're never off stage. We're never off stage. We're backstage and we're on stage, but we're never off stage. When are we taking the time, especially even more so when you're in transition, You've got to get off stage. You gotta rest to be at your best. And that you're not any good for anybody else if you're not good to yourself. It's the light that shines the farthest is always going to shine the brightest at home. You got to keep that light going. So you can't give away something that you don't have. So to answer your question very, dramatically, I went through a season of burnout. And the problem with burnout is once you burn out, you can't, I mean, you can't burnout, recovering from burnout is a trickle charge. I mean, you can't just like plug back in or take a couple of days off and recover from burnout, and you don't know you're burned out until you're burned out. It's too late.
So is there
So I
anything you would do different
think,
knowing you didn't realize it was happening, but then it happened?
yeah, I think that the easiest way to do it is to keep a 20% margin at all times. So like this past Christmas, for example, we had this a very hectic season. I was already in the middle of a transition professionally that wasn't public yet, but was kind of happening, and my heart was in two different places. All these things are going on. I had a release of a new book, and all this stuff was happening at Christmas, and I mean, just all this personal stuff, all this professional stuff, and parties and get-togethers. And right in the middle of that, we had a young lady that was a high schooler who is same age as my daughter, who earlier in the year 16, 17 years old, had had a double lung transplant. She had struggled for her whole life with which resulted in her needing to have this double lung transplant. So she had this, and everything was looking good. And just a couple of days before Christmas, Doug, she passed away. And so here I am, like on a couple of days before Christmas Eve, and I've had Thanksgiving and hustles and Christmases and parties and all this stuff, and I'm running 110%. I'm giving it my all. I'm at everything. I'm seeing everybody. I'm shaking all the hands, doing all this stuff, and I'm already at my wit's end, and I'm walking into a situation now where I have to preach a young lady's funeral. It's the same age as my daughter. So you got to leave some margin. And again, that may not be your story. It's easy to see it when I tell that. It's easy to connect with the weight of that. But every leader is carrying some type of weight like that is very personal, very meaningful. And even in your family, my life when I was a pastor was very public and out in the front, and I was on stage a lot. So I had to navigate the backstage thing even more. And I think if you're a leader in any capacity where you're out front, you're on stage a lot, or you're backstage a lot, if that's a regular rhythm of yours, you've got to, even in those places, keep a 20% margin. Don't ever run above 80% because you don't know when something terrible or traumatic is going to happen out of the blue. And if you're already at your wit's end, you're going to break. We're just working with a couple, Doug, just this past week, and I use a resource with them called Prepare and Rich, and they answer questions. And one of the gauges is stress profile. And on a scale of 1 to 100, he was at a 99 and she was at a 92.
Wow.
So the problem with that is, just think through it. If they're running at 90+% stress in their life, both of them, are we really ready to tackle the problems in their relationship?
Right.
Nah, it's like a surgeon trying to operate on something that's already swollen or infected. And let's get the infection down. Let's get the swelling down before we start doing anything major. So in that situation, I think my thought was, let's don't work on the problems in your relationship. Let's work on your togetherness. And let's talk about how we reduce this stress. And I think that is a very quantitative, that number, 99, 92. That's probably the reality of what most of us are dealing with when we're in transition. So how do we make sure that we're giving some time to get that back down below 80 so that if something does, out of our control even, or as a result of our own failures, like something happens that we don't have a 10% jump in stress when we're already at 92, that's the lid off the top. I mean, that's and my dad did his PhD in counseling, and I'll say this, he used to talk about stress a lot. And his whole thing was stress is not bad. Stress is not a bad thing. Distress is a bad thing. When stress gets to a level to where it's damaging you, it's distressful. So you go to the gym and you don't stress your muscles, you ain't gotten much of a workout. But if you go to the gym and you stress your muscles too much and you injure yourself, you've come to a point of distress.
Yeah. Yeah. As you were discussing that, I was looking at my notes here from Yount on this Created to Learn book. And he talked about the value of prayer when it comes to education, not necessarily transition, but I
Mhm.
recall that the job that I just finished, that it was one of the most, no, it was the most stressful time in my life. And so,
Wow.
yet I still on the drive to work, it was 6 in the morning. I was the first one going into work trying to figure this thing out, and I never figured it out. But
Yeah.
I remember those walks. I was driving past the location this past week, um, 30-minute
Mm.
drive, and I
Mhm.
saw the path that I would get out every morning and take a walk, take my Bible. Some mornings it was 2 minutes.
Yeah.
I just I just cried out to the Lord. I just prayed, and he talked about four areas to pray, and I just thought it was helpful. We'll wrap this up, and then I want to talk about learning as a Christian leader and apologetics here as we close
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
But he talked about praying he was talking about a student, but praying for your people by name, praying for your staff by name, for your student by name. Obviously, we do that with our family quite often, but it can get laborious if you have a big group, but
Yeah.
there's power in that. Praying for your preparation, whether you're a teacher, a preacher, a leader, praying that as you prepare, as you strategize, as you set goals, praying specifically about that preparation. Some of us are really good at planning and preparation. We don't need God. We can do it ourselves and then ask him to bless it. Well, back up a little bit, ask him to help with the preparation. Give us insight and wisdom according to James 1:5.
Yeah.
And then he said, pray for the actual time. I prayed for this podcast. I prayed for you during the actual execution, the teaching. We prayed together before we started. So doing that, that's the obvious one, right? That's where communicators and leaders and trainers spend most of their time, is on the stage. I love how you talked about behind the stage. Strategize that with your calendar, your 20% time.
Absolutely.
And then what was the last one? I think he had one more. Oh, pray for the action. Like you talked about, you have the drive, you do the
Mhm.
planning, but then pray that people will go to Matthew 7:24, not just hearing the
Mhm.
words, but putting them into action, being a doer and not just a hearer. Some of us have the drive and the vision, but we just won't pull the trigger and get to the doing part because that's hard. Anything to add there, or what I'd like to do is kind of move on to the last section here.
One of my favorite books and one of my least favorite books is a book by Leonard Ravenhill.
Oh
It's
yeah.
titled Why Revival Tarries, and he's written a whole sequence of books, but that one was given to me when I first moved to Austin, Texas, years ago by the one of the guys I was there to work with. And Leonard Ravenhill in his book, he said that no man is greater than his prayer life.
Mhm.
He also goes on to say that a praying man will stop sinning, but a sinning man will stop praying.
Mm.
These things go together. There's something about prayer. It's clear, and you mentioned apologetics just a minute ago. It's important to understand that God is unchanging. We know his characteristic is what we would say is immutable. It means he is an unchanging being. By the way, you don't want a God that's changing all the time. That's not the kind of God you would want. I mean, that doesn't sound like
Yeah.
God at all. You want somebody that's faithful and true and steadfast and all those things. I mean, and it's not just what we want, it's what's necessary. God is a necessary being, and it's necessary that he be the unmoving mover of all things, the unchanging changer of all things, right? And the uncaused causer of all things. So when you think about God from that standpoint, and you start talking about prayer, the interesting thing is if you don't understand or have never really come face to face with the idea and the truth that God is an unchanging being, an uncreated, unchanging, and unmoving being, then prayer is pretty simple. It's like the genie in the bottle. Just say, God, this is what I want. Give it to me, please. Amen. But when you understand that God is an unchanging being, it really doesn't become about you changing him because that's impossible. So my mentor, Norm Geisler, used to say it this way, and it is much better than what I could say it and much more succinct. He said that prayer is not our way of getting our will done in heaven. Prayer is God's way of getting his will done on earth. So when we pray, prayer is not our way of getting our will done in heaven. It's God's way of getting his will done on earth. So prayer does change things because God is the unchanging changer of all things. If you get involved with God, he's going to change you. He's going to make you a new creation. He's going to, so change is part of the experience with God. You're not going to stay the same if you get close to God. You're going to change. That's why prayer is so important, because prayer is that dedicated time where you're close with God, you're hearing from God. And there's a lot about prayer that people don't understand, because they think of it simplistically, as simply praying for, what you need.
Yes.
But one of the books that I've really appreciated that I pass on in this context too is called The Hour That Changes the World. And it basically takes a whole sequence. So it creates a circular type pattern with all the biblical principles of what prayer should be. And certainly asking for things from God is part of that. Requesting things from God, let your request be known. So that's part of it, but that's only one. And so he has all these different things. I think it's 12 actually that are about, he puts them in 5-minute segments. And when you do 5 minutes on all 12, it's 60 minutes. And I think that's the mixture, but it's the hour. He says that if you integrate the holistic biblical aspects of what prayer is presented as, then you get the holistic results of what prayer was designed to deliver in our lives. And it's not changing God. It's not getting what I want from him. It's getting what is, God is already predisposed to give good things to his children, is give his blessings though. That's the thing, is it's not what we want that we want. It's what he wants that we want, even if it doesn't feel that way, because he always has our best interest in mind. So anyway, that's my thoughts on
No,
prayer.
there's probably nothing better to do in the back room than to pray and
Yeah.
backstage. So I just
And
we're
off stage. And
and
off
off
stage.
stage,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. And we just finished up. We're attending Times Square Church virtually right now while we're up here in New
Mm,
York. And so uh,
yeah.
Delina just did a 15-week series on prayer, and it motivated me. I went back to some of the books, Tozier and Murray, and Ravenhill is one you mentioned too. And maybe you don't know how to pray, or maybe you haven't prayed, and just open up the Bible during this season of suffering or tribulation that I went through. I just learned to pray the Psalms, and I read them and put them in my own words. And so I think you're right that if we can just take that margin, that 20%, include prayer as part of it, that's a great thing for transition, a great thing for leaders, and a great thing for life. Now,
Oh,
you
yeah.
have talked about everybody else except yourself. You've recommended books. I want to talk about Prove It and
Yeah.
learning as a leader, why it's important as a Christian leader. We have marketplace, we have ministry, we are all sanctioned, anointed, we're all priests. And so we all have a responsibility. But tell us about Prove It, and why it's important as a Christian leader to care about apologetics and defending your faith.
Yeah. So the book that I wrote titled Prove It came out of my own personal journey, a real question of how do I really know God exists and that Christianity is true? And what I found was the local church, and I don't blame them. It probably was a result of my own casual approach, but I just wasn't equipped to handle the questions that life gave me. When I was 21 years old, 2 weeks away from graduating from college, my father died. And when he died, it really sparked a lot of questions that aren't just for unbelievers. Like the skeptic of Christianity is going to struggle with the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. It's the common ground we stand on. Pain is the common ground that all humanity stands on. And so when you get in moments of evil, pain, and suffering, whether it's a natural evil like a hurricane that destroys your home, or a moral evil like somebody does something awful to you, whatever that is, it forces you to ask the question, if God's so good and he's all knowing and he's all powerful, why is he allowing this to happen? So apologetics, and by the way, there is an answer to that. For a long time, people would just say, well, you just have to have faith. You just have to trust. Well, I do think that that's a part of it, faith and trust. But, Thomas Aquinas, in antiquity, hundreds of years ago, he would probably be a good contributor to this conversation, because we know that we can't reason our way into a relationship of God with God. Reason will not get us in relationship with God, nor will good works. But reason, you never figure out, you may figure out that God exists, like C.S. Lewis did. He became a theist and a monotheist through his intellect, but he became a Christian through his faith. The word faith and the word belief come from the same Greek word. So in Ephesians 2, it says it's by faith that you have been saved. That's the Greek word that is also, and it's in one form there. Faith is an action word in John 3:16, believe, but it's the same word, faith, believe. That is an important thing. It's by faith that we are in relationship with God, that we're made right, that we're transformed from death to life. We become a new creation. But it would be wrong to say that our faith is not rational or reasonable. That's where we have to be careful. We're not saved by faith. We're not saved by reason. Our reason doesn't save us. Our faith saves us. In fact, it's not even our faith. It's the object of our faith that saves us. It's not the activity of our faith. It's the object of our faith. Because you can have faith in an inauthentic Jesus or an inauthentic Savior, and you're not going to get authentic salvation. So it's the object of our faith that saves us, but it is faith in that object that activates that and initiates that. And there's a lot of conversations theologically about how that happens. But for the purposes of this, I just want to say it's not a reasoning. You're not going to figure out how to be in relationship with God. You're never going to do that with your mind or your emotions or your cultural intelligence either. Throw that in. None of that's going to put you in a relationship with God. It's only by faith, but that faith in God is reasonable and it is rational, and we can answer people's questions. So in Peter wrote this, that we should always be prepared to provide a defense for the hope that's inside of us. That word defense in the Greek is the word apologia, which is where we get the word apologetics, which, by the way, they teach apologetics in the legal industry. It's simply providing a defense. So we are called on to be prepared, not to always do it. That's the interesting thing. It doesn't say always give a defense. It says always be prepared to give a defense for the hope that's inside of you. And then it also says to do that with gentleness and with respect. That's where a lot of folks miss it in the Christian lane. We always know what we're against, but we forget that we're for people. So with apologetics, one of the challenges is a lot of times people think in Christianity kind of narcissistically. They put themselves in the middle. They say, all right, well, here's where I am, and here's the world over here, and then God's over here, and I'm in the middle, and God's trying to pull me away from the world.
That's good.
That's a narcissistic understanding of what's really going on. What's really happening is God is in the center, and he's called us out of the world, but he is in relentless pursuit of that world. So the world's over here. God is in relentless pursuit. He says that it's God's good and perfect will that all men come to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean that everyone will. It just means that anyone that hasn't is outside of the good and perfect will of God in justification. So you put God in the center and we're over here. So we're chasing after God as he's in relentless pursuit of the world. So we should be in the world, but not of it. And so the apologetics posture that I would like to really suggest is that we need to love people enough to answer their hard questions. Apologetics today is just simply, for you Christians out there, it's just pre-evangelism. It's just setting the table to be able to have a conversation about the good news. You can't have that conversation if people don't have the prerequisite settings for that to settle in. And certainly we want to pray for them, and this is a spiritual matter. Don't take anything away from that. But you can be spiritual and love people enough to answer their hard questions. And so for me, even as a Christian in my early 20s, when my dad died, it made me very vulnerable for Satan to steal, kill, and destroy all the things that God had for me. And even when I talk with people that are skeptics or unbelievers, just simply removing the boundary and letting them see the reality that God doesn't want you to check out your brain when you come into a relationship with him. We're supposed to worship him with our mind as well. So we can never connect with God in a salvation type way. We can never be justified because of our rational thoughts or because we're really smart or we figured out the puzzle. It's only by faith. It's always going to be an edge of mystery to it. But that faith itself is reasonable and it's rational.
That's really good. I thought of the book Pursuit of God by A.W.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good one too, if people are
Great
searching.
mind.
Any other resources you'd recommend? for those who want to know more about being a better Christian apologist or
Yeah,
being
there's a
Christian or
yeah, there's probably some really great written resources, but today's age, a lot of it is about what you can access through digital media. A couple of our graduates from Southern Evangelical Seminary that are doing a really good job. One is Frank Turek. Dr. Frank Turek is cross-examined, and if you connect with him, he's got a lot of other folks like Alyssa Childers. Um, Red Pen Logic is another one that's really reaching a lot of Tim Barnett's ministry. Greg Kokel's ministry out in California, Standard Reason. There's a lot of them out there, but if you just kind of step out there a little bit, it'll be a chain reaction and you'll be able to find the answers that you're looking for.
Awesome. Well, Stephen, I really appreciate the time. It was good to
Same here.
chat again, and I look forward to maybe doing this again someday. And good luck in your transition, and God's blessing on you.
Thanks. It's been a joy. Thank you, Doug.
All right, man. Take care.
All right. See you, bro.